This section is, I guess, what we might call ethical motivations. And this is reflective of that idea I talked about at the beginning of the previous lecture, that our ethics is not just what we do, but why we do what we do. And the material that I want to give to you in this section is about not just what we do, but why we do what we do. Or not just what other people do, but why they do what they do. And so what we're going to ultimately build here is 9 different ethical motivations, more or less. Some people call them ethical categories. That feels a little too hard, fast to me. But different ways that people are motivated in the choices that they make. But generally, to get into this lecture and my live classes and kind of illustrate how behavior and motivations can create a lot of variation in ethical approach, I'll throw a few situations out to the class. And I'll have them tell me not just what they would do in that situation, but why they would do it. And I'll list those motivations on the board. And so one example I'll give them is that you're sitting in a red light at 4 in the morning. And it's staying red, much longer than you think it ought to be staying red. And so the question is, would you run the light? And so first of all, I say, how many of y'all think you'd run the light? And of course, you know, like 90% of them raise their hands. And I say, okay, so why would you run the light? Well, we end up with several reasons on the board why they would run the light. You know, some of them, it's just inconvenient. I need to get home. I've got to be somewhere. I'm not sure where at 4 in the morning, but I've got to be somewhere. Some of them are, you know, they'll say, well, you know, if you think about why we have traffic lights, and that's to protect people, and at 4 in the morning, if, you know, there's nobody on the road, then it would seem safe to go ahead and reasonable to go ahead and run the light. You know, so there's a lot of approaches to that. And then I'll ask, how many of you might sit at the light? And there's always some that raise their hands. Well, why? Well, I never break traffic laws. I've already got too many points on my license, and if I would get caught, I'd be in trouble. I can't afford to pay a ticket. You know, there's a lot of different motivations for doing the same thing. Or the other example I'll ask them is that you're at Walmart Supercenter and you accidentally dent someone else's parked car. Would you leave a note? Well, we get all kinds of responses to that. First of all, as far as why you would leave a note, lots of reasons why people would leave a note. It's the right thing to do, it's legal, it's happened to me, I wouldn't want someone to not leave a note for me. Why would you not leave a note? I couldn't afford to fix it, I wouldn't have insurance to pay for it, happened to me one time and nobody left a note. I mean, there's lots of reasons why people might do the same thing. And so we talk about how, okay, so 10 of you might be sitting at red lights around Springfield waiting for them to turn green, doing the same action, the same conduct, the same practice, but there might be 4 or 5 different motivations for why. 30 of them might not leave a note on a car that they dent in the Walmart parking lot. Same conduct, same practice, but the motivations vary as far as why they would not and why they would justify that behavior. So as we look at these motivations, and again, ultimately we're going to talk about 9 different ways of looking at ethical motivation. These involve not just what a person does, but why a person does what they do. And maybe even more so, why. And so that's why I tend to call them ethical motivations instead of categories. Broadly speaking, we're going to look at 2 broad categories of ethical motivation. The first of those is consequentialist ethics, and the second of those is non-consequentialist ethics. And then everything we're going to talk about, the 9 we're going to talk about, fall under those categories. To talk about ethical motivation as consequentialist or non-consequentialist is not referring to whether there are consequences or not. It's not saying, okay, some things have consequences, some things don't. Not saying that. Everything we do has consequences. Even if we'd like to think what we do doesn't have consequences, it does. Whatever, it may be small, it may be more than what we realize, but everything we do does have consequences. But it's the idea of whether the potential consequences highly motivate what we do or not. For some people, what they do is based on looking at the potential consequences and then aligning their behavior to either avoiding or achieving those consequences. For other people, even though there are consequences, and they may be aware of those consequences, something besides potential consequences ultimately motivates their behavior. And we'll break that down as we go through these. So let's start with consequentialist ethics. Consequentialist ethics may also be called, and you might find them called, teleological ethics. And teleological, the root of that is telos, again from the Greek. And telos means end or goal. So as I've said earlier, teleological or consequentialist ethics are about focusing on the potential end or the potential goal. And so it focuses on what you either want to have happen ultimately or what you don't want to have happen ultimately, and making choices that head toward that. Typically that goal is either to avoid something or to gain something. I don't want to pay the ticket, so I'm not going to leave a note. Or I'm not going to pay to fix that car, so I'm not going to leave a note. I'm avoiding pain. I need to get somewhere and I'm running late, so I need to run the stoplight. Trying to gain some benefit, looking ahead, or looking at a goal. So consequentialist ethics are about aligning my choices with a goal or an end I want to achieve, or a goal or an end I want to avoid. So I want to talk about three kinds of consequentialist ethics. Teleological hedonism, teleological utilitarianism, and naturalism. What teleological hedonism focuses on, as you might suspect with using the word hedonism, is achieving the best goal for myself. That my motivation is what's going to bring about the best result for me, or what's going to avoid the most painful result for me, and making choices based on that. I used to have students write a paper in this unit where they would apply these ethical categories to themselves. It was amazing how many students identified themselves as teleological hedonists. That most of what they do is looking at what's going to get me the most in the situation, or what's going to keep me out of trouble in this situation, and so I'm going to do whatever it takes to reach that goal. Any of these teleological ethics are really about a phrase that you might be familiar with that says the end justifies the means. Whatever end I hope to achieve or avoid, whatever goal I hope to achieve or avoid, justifies any action I do to reach that. And the teleological hedonist says, particularly for myself. This is a little bit different than the second teleological or consequentialist ethic, teleological utilitarianism. And you may be familiar with that term. That utilitarianism is the idea of achieving the greatest good or the best end or the best result for the greatest number of people. What's going to best serve the majority in the situation, or the majority of people affected by this situation, is utilitarian ethic, regardless of whether it benefits me or not. So laying aside hedonism and choosing what's best for the group. If you're in a situation in life where you're responsible for a family, you're a manager on a job, a classroom, in some way responsible for other people, you may often be called upon to apply utilitarian ethic. What's going to be the best thing for the most people in this situation? That's utilitarian ethic. Now, I always want to make the distinction there that sometimes I'll have students, as we talk about this, or as I have them maybe write how they respond to a situation and how they would apply this to their own motivation. I'll have some students say, I always do what everybody else wants in a situation, so I'm a utilitarian. Well, I always call that into question. Because if someone always does what everybody else wants in the situation, what's the true motivation? Well, often it's that I won't be rejected, or that I will be accepted. So it's really a hedonistic ethic. I'll do whatever you want because it will benefit me if I do that. But the utilitarian is about truly being concerned for the group. And the reality is, if I'm a part of a group, and it's a group that I identify with, the likelihood is if I'm doing what's best for the group, it's probably best for me too, because I'm part of that group and I identify myself with the needs and the desires of that group. But the main motivation is what's best for the group. A third kind of consequentialist ethic is what some call naturalism. And the basic idea of naturalism is that if you let the natural processes play out, you will get the best result. And so it's choosing not an uncaring, ambivalent approach to a situation, but a situation that says, I think if we leave our hands off this, as hard as it might be to do, the best result will happen. Probably the clearest example of that is laissez-faire capitalism. That's really an ethical approach to economic systems. Because what that says is, put as few controls on the economic system as possible, let it be as free as it possibly can be, and the best thing will happen in the economic system. That's a naturalistic ethic. Parents who maybe have older children in high school or college who want to have their hands in everything their kids are doing often probably reach a point where they realize, I need to keep my hands off. As much as I want to have my hands in all this, I need to just stand back and watch and hope for the best. And parents will sometimes choose to do that because they believe ultimately that will achieve the best end instead of meddling and having their hands in every situation, that might create more chaos and make things worse. Well, that's a naturalistic ethic. So some people are motivated by looking at the consequences. What do we want to have happen? What do we want to avoid happening? And so I will justify whatever I do that will achieve that. But there's another category that I mentioned, non-consequentialist ethics, where even though there are consequences, even though the person may consider those consequences, the ultimate decision is made because of something besides the consequences. And so, as you have here, something other than the consequences determines the behavior or the choice. And this first one, I think, illustrates that well. One kind of non-consequentialist ethic is deontological ethics. Deon, the root of that meaning duty or responsibility. And so the idea of a deontological ethic is that it's a principle-centered ethic. That choices are made based on principles that people hold. So I dent someone's car in the Walmart parking lot. And I say, well, I'm going to leave a note. And my friend says, why are you going to leave a note? And I say, because it's the right thing to do. Deontological. And they say, yeah, but that was a 2008 BMW and you don't have any money. You can't pay for that. You don't need to be leaving a note. That's consequentialist. They're looking at the consequences and saying, based on that, this is what you should or should not do. I'm saying, I'm looking at a principle. And even though I know this is going to cost me money I don't have, even though this is going to bring pain to my life, even though I might sell my car to pay to fix this car, I'm going to live by a principle that says you do the right thing. That's a deontological ethic. Sometimes that's clear, based on rules, laws, standards, handbooks. And so you just do the right thing because you're told this is the right thing to do in a situation. Sometimes it's based more on intuition. But it's saying regardless of what it cost me, or regardless of whether I gain anything or not, I'm going to choose a principle that I live by, a deontological ethic. A second kind of non-consequentialist ethics is what some call contextual ethics, meaning that what someone does is based on the context that they're in, or the situation that they're in, or the immediate moment. To some extent, that maxim of carpe diem, seize the day, to some extent is a contextual ethic. That you need to create the most meaning you can in this moment. Some of you might be familiar with an Epicurean ethic that says eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we might die. That's a contextual ethic. Create the most meaning you can in the moment in front of you, because you don't know if you'll have tomorrow. So don't look at the future. Don't make your choices based on the future. Make your choices based on now. I always make the observation to students in my classes that in the area around campus, especially probably on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights, there's a lot of contextual ethics going on, where people are creating what they perceive to be meaning in the moment, even knowing they might regret that tomorrow. But it's not tomorrow. Even knowing someone may be upset at them when they find out what they did. But that person's not here right now. And so in the moment, you create meaning, or what you perceive to be meaning, regardless of what it may cost you, regardless of principles you may typically hold. You seize the moment and deal with the fallout of that if it comes, but that's not the primary consideration. Even though someone might say, you know, my boyfriend will kill me when he finds out I did this, but the contextualist says, but he's not here right now. And so they go with the moment, despite what they look at the potential is in the future. A third kind of non-consequentialist ethics, which brings us back around to the religious aspect of what we're talking about here, is a category that could be called theistic ethics. And this is when you see a word that has theos in it, you know it has something to do with God or with religion. And so it's the idea that one's choices are based on their belief in God. And it's not just the people who say they believe in God but don't really ever do anything that reflects that, but a theistic ethic is someone who says, I believe in this religious system, or I believe in a particular God, and so I will behave in a certain way as a result of that. I will let that affect the choices that I make. It's the transformation of my behavior in response to what I perceive to be ultimate. Most of you have lived long enough to know, though, that you can have a bunch of people who really truly are motivated to do the right thing based on their religious beliefs, but they will not all do the same thing. They all come at it differently. Even within the same religious group, you won't have them all do the same thing. So we want to talk about 4 subcategories, or 4 types of theistic ethics. First of all, there's theistic legalism. As you might suspect, theistic legalism is about following the laws of a religion. That if it's what the Bible says, it's what I do. If it's what my church teaches, it's what I do. If it's what my religious mentor or guru or teacher says, it's what I will do. It's clear, it's black and white, theistic legalism, following the laws, the teachings of the religion. A second type of theistic ethics, or second approach to theistic ethical decision-making, is theistic revelation. And theistic revelation, you might remember that way back at the beginning of the course, we talked about the idea of revelation, and that revelation is an experience that we attribute to a supernatural source. And so someone who comes at things from a perspective of theistic revelation is waiting for guidance from a supernatural source. Maybe a vision, maybe a dream, maybe a glowing billboard that they believe God. I mean, it could be several things. Probably the best example, though, of theistic revelation would be answered prayer, where you ask someone how they came to a decision, and they say, I prayed about it for a long time, and God just started opening and closing doors and showing me what I should do. Or I prayed about it for a long time, and I just got an overwhelming sense of peace that this is what I should or shouldn't do. Well, that would be theistic revelation, that it's not necessarily based on any laws, it's not anything written in black and white, but it's based on some sort of an experience with deity that guided them into the choice that they made. A third kind of theistic ethics is theistic rationalism. Theistic rationalism is rooted really in 2 presuppositions. One of those presuppositions is that God is rational. And so if I can determine what the rational thing to do in a situation is, then I've determined the will of God, because God is rational. And the second presupposition of theistic rationalism is that humans are capable of rationality. Because God can be rational, but if I'm not capable of finding what's rational, then I can't find His will. And so theistic rationalism says if you as a human are capable of determining what's rational, then you are capable of determining the will of God, because God's will is always rational. And so this person might make a list of pros and cons, might make a list of benefits and cost, and rationally say, this is what makes the most sense, so this must be the will of God. They make a list of pros and cons. Whichever list is longer, they write God's will on that list, because that's rational. And if God truly is rational, then that must be the will of God. The fourth kind of theistic ethics is called Theistic Situationism, or sometimes Situational Ethics. Situationism is a specific ethic and kind of an outlined ethic. Was developed in the 1960s as a Christian ethic by a man named Joseph Fletcher, and he wrote a book called Situational Ethics. And even though he wrote from a Christian perspective, trying to determine how he saw Jesus as making decisions and developing this ethic, I think certainly what you find is that other major religions also have the same approach, even though it may not be about Jesus, but it's the same approach. And I think you'll see why here in a second. Because what Fletcher decided, as he looked at the decision-making of Jesus, was that, one, Jesus was concerned about being true to the teachings of his religion. So to some extent, he was a legalist. He followed the teachings, the rules of his religion, generally. But what Fletcher determined was that there's the laws of the religion that were important to Jesus, but there was one law that was a supreme law in Jesus' estimation, and that was the law of love. And so in a situation where there seemed to be a discrepancy between just the outright religious law and what was the loving or compassionate thing to do, Jesus would subjugate this law to the law of love, or the law of compassion. And so he would say things like, I desire compassion and not whatever this is. I desire love and not whatever this is. If you really want to show people you follow me, love. Let that be the overarching command. When people asked Jesus what the most important command was, love was the answer to that. And so Fletcher said that the situational ethic is saying, follow the laws of your religion, but one law is supreme over all laws, and that's the law of love. And so when there's a discrepancy, choose to act responsibly out of love, or to act responsibly out of compassion. That's not unique to Christianity. You can find that idea of exercising love for your neighbor, doing the most loving thing, in every major religious teaching. And so you'll find Buddhists who would also talk about this same ethic of acting responsibly out of love, and Hindus, and Muslims, and Jews, as well as Christians. The situational ethic that says, act responsibly out of love, live guided by the supreme law of love. So you should have 9 motivations. You have consequentialist ethics, and under that there's 3, hedonism, utilitarianism, and naturalism. And then we have non-consequentialist ethics, things that motivate us besides solely the consequence. And under that you have deontological ethics, contextual ethics, and then 4 kinds of theistic ethics, as different approaches that people make as their ethics is not just what they do, but why they do what they do.